removing steam trains from the railways had a curious knock-on effect, namely the danger posed to trespassers. Trespassing had never been particularly encouraged on the railways. Huskisson had established early on that trains and pedestrians made a bad combination. Fines had been put in place for those who were caught, and workers instructed to apprehend trespassers where practical. But this was a law few paid attention to. For too many, the railways served as a useful shortcut, and steam trains could be heard coming from a long distance away. But diesels were much quieter and lacked the column of smoke to announce their presence. Electric trains were quieter still, and brought the additional risk of electrocution. With fatalities climbing, British Rail decided what was needed was a public information film to scare people off. What they produced was called The Finish Line, in which a child who's been told not to play on the railway begins to fantasise about what would happen if they held school sports day there, resulting in a lot of children getting hit by trains. The film was so shocking to the British public that it was quietly pulled from circulation after 2 weeks. Nonetheless, it, and others like it, did the trick of getting the message across, and trespassing is much less accepted on the tracks today. Some accidents are much worse than others. 1976 saw the worst ever peacetime disaster on the London Underground. On the morning of the 28th of February, a train was pulling into Moorgate station at the end of the Northern City line, but the train was not slowing down, with no sound from the brakes. Some eyewitnesses even claimed it was accelerating. The driver, Leslie Newson, was spotted in his cab, hands on the controls and staring straight ahead. The train shot through into a runoff tunnel where sand traps had been placed to slow trains down, but the momentum was great enough to break through all of them and smash into the wall at the end, telescoping the first carriage into a crumpled heap and mangling 2 more behind. It took 14 hours for workers to recover the final survivor, and 4 days to find the final body, that of Newson himself. In all, 43 people were killed and 73 injured. The cause of the accident remains a mystery. Thorough analysis of the train ruled out mechanical or electrical error. Newson was a very experienced driver, and simply taking his hands off the controls would have engaged the dead man's handle and applied the brakes. Suicide is a possibility, but friends agreed that he had been in a happy mood that morning. He had £270 in his bag, with plans to buy his daughter her first car after work. The official inquest simply concluded accidental death. Accidents were an issue, but British Rail was facing a more fundamental problem. The importance of the railways was shrinking. Passenger numbers were continuing to decline, their finances were suffering, and though line closures had slowed in Beeching's absence, they had not stopped altogether. The problem was, the public had lost confidence in the future of the railways. To many, they represented a relic of a bygone era, and attention was increasingly shifting to other forms of transport. It was decided that new technology and new ideas were needed to inspire the imagination once more, and show that far from hanging on, British Rail were looking to the future. First, they announced plans for further electrification of key routes, electricity being a more clean and exciting system than diesel. By 1974, the West Coast Main Line had been electrified in full, along with several local routes. To simplify operations, British Rail brought in the TOPS computer system as a tool to aid the organisation of the network, replacing a nightmarish system of logbooks. This allowed them to run more services more efficiently. Not every new idea was a success. In 1970, British Rail looked once more into the possibility of expanding into air travel. This time, they would focus on a method which would allow them to run services directly between their main stations without having to build an airstrip on the roof, namely the helicopter. Engineer Charles Osmond Frederick was assigned the task of designing a special British Rail helicopter. For reasons best known to himself, Frederick took the brief and designed a spaceship, featuring a laser-driven fusion generator which would create energy pulses at 1,000 Hz or less to avoid damaging the craft. The pulses would be transferred out of a nozzle into a series of radial electrodes running along the underside of the craft, which would convert the energy into electricity that would then pass into a ring of powerful electric magnets using superconductors to carry the charge better. The magnets would accelerate subatomic particles produced by the fusion reactor, creating lift and thrust. He admitted that the main drawback was that none of this technology actually existed, but he was confident that it would eventually. Despite the overall insanity of the idea, legal technicalities at British Rail required them to submit a patent application for any design their researchers drew up. Thus, for 3 years, British Rail owned the patent for a flying saucer. Obviously, it was never followed through. Even commercial helicopter travel proved a non-starter, as most who can afford to regularly travel by helicopter can also afford to just buy their own. Back on Earth, British Rail were rethinking their attitude to coaches. The replacement of steam with diesel had initially continued with the locomotive model, in which one big engine would pull along a string of unpowered coaches. Now they began to look to the carriage as an integral part of the train, following the multiple unit model which had proved successful with electric services. A small diesel generator, powering an electric motor in each carriage, allowed traction to be applied throughout the train, making starting and stopping much more efficient. In the busier commuter services, several multiple units could be attached together with minimal difficulty. High-speed express services also began to be treated as a whole unit, with a locomotive at each end in a push-me-pull-you arrangement, with the carriages unpowered to create a smoother ride for passengers. Just like the multiple unit trains, they could be run in either direction equally well, eliminating the need to turn the engine round at the end of the run, as had been the case with steam trains. This new focus gave a great boost to British Rail's plan to improve high-speed travel. Studies of what was happening in places like Japan had drawn the conclusion that every increase of 1 mile an hour in running speed correlated with a 1% increase in passenger numbers. The problem was, most of the network had been built to handle trains which would rarely exceed 80 km an hour. Trains were now capable of running much faster, but were restrained by the need to constantly slow down for bends. Partially this was to avoid the risk of tipping over, but also to avoid the more immediate problem of lateral g-forces throwing passengers around. Engineers decided to adopt the same approach as a high-speed motorcyclist, leaning into the bend so that the lateral g-forces forcing them outwards will be compensated for by the gravity pulling them over. To this end, they designed the Advanced Passenger Train, or APT. Each carriage would be equipped with hydraulic rams, which would tilt the carriages into the bends at a precisely calculated angle. The project was held up by British Rail as the saviour of rail travel that would revolutionise people's journeys everywhere. But from its inception in 1972, the project was hit by one delay after another, not helped by a management which kept adjusting the scope, most notably changing the power system from diesel to electric midway through development. It was not until December 1979 that the first prototype was ready for a run. In these tests, the APT set the still-standing British speed record of 259 km an hour, or 161 miles an hour. But even then, the APT was far from ready for commercial use. Fortunately, British Rail were working on another project at the same time, initially intended to fill the gap until the APT was complete, but soon to become the main focus of their attention. It was a project to develop a much more conventional express engine known as the High Speed Train, or HST. Many new engines will be produced from this research, but easily the most famous was the Intercity 125. The Intercity 125 was designed to incorporate the best systems available, clever suspension systems to handle bends and provide a smoother ride for passengers, AC generators in place of DC to produce more power, and disc brakes used in place of clasp brakes so they could brake later before the bends. The result was a train which could easily cruise along at the desired speed of 125 miles an hour or 200 kilometers an hour, speeds which the fastest steam train in the world had struggled to reach just once. On one of the first runs of the prototype, it set a world speed record for diesel trains at 230 kilometers an hour or 143 miles an hour. The Intercity 125 made its first run between London and Cardiff in 1976 and proved an instant success. Travel time between the two cities was reduced by 25 minutes, and places like Reading and Swindon came within an hour's travel of central London, almost becoming commuter towns for the capital. Buoyed by this success, British Rail introduced the Intercity to other high-speed express routes. Passenger numbers climbed rapidly everywhere it was introduced. The Intercity 125 was one of the great success stories of British Rail. But passenger numbers climbing in intercity routes were accompanied by a decline in passengers elsewhere, nor was Intercity filling the financial hole British Rail was suffering from. Nonetheless, there was evidence that attitudes were shifting in the right direction. Though passenger numbers were not rising steadily, they were holding steady and could rise soon. Cars take up a lot of space, and this was space the country was rapidly running out of. The standard solution for much of the 20th century was to build more roads to relieve pressure, but it was becoming increasingly clear that this was not a permanent solution. Work expands to fill the time to do it. Focusing on more road building sets the precedent that everyone should have a car. More people take to the roads, and traffic becomes just as bad as it was before, if not worse. And there was little room left for new roads, with protests against them on the rise. In this background, people began to look towards alternatives to the roads, and once more, the railways were beginning to look attractive. The next decade or so would define the future of British Rail, and indeed the railways in general, but that is a subject for next time. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and why not leave a comment to help the channel grow? I am currently working on part 17 of this series, which should be with you in the next couple of months. In the meantime, why not check out the rest of the series, or have a look at my website and my Etsy pages for more examples of my artwork. See you soon!